James sat on a worn-out park bench, the chilly morning air biting at his skin. The world seemed indifferent to his presence, just like every other day. Dressed in layers of mismatched clothes, he had learned to adapt to the cold and the invisibility that came with his current life. As he stared at the pigeons fluttering nearby, the sudden sound of footsteps approached, heavy and authoritative. James Carter, a stern voice, interrupted his thoughts. Looking up, he saw two uniformed police officers standing over him. Confusion crossed his weathered face as he instinctively straightened, as though somehow that would change what was about to happen. "Yes, that's me," he replied hesitantly. The officer in charge, Officer Mitchell, pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "You're under arrest for the theft of a luxury watch. Please stand up." James blinked in disbelief. "I didn't steal anything," he stammered, panic rising in his chest. Ignoring his protests, the officers cuffed his wrists, pulling him to his feet. Around them, curious onlookers began to gather, whispering and pointing. To them, James was already guilty. A homeless man in handcuffs surely had done something wrong. The humiliation was unbearable. James lowered his gaze to the ground, wishing it would swallow him whole. The officers led him through the crowded park, his wrists tightly bound behind his back. James' mind raced. He had no idea what they were talking about. The allegations felt like a dream, one of those that didn't make sense, but still left a bitter taste in the mouth. They reached the police car, and James was pushed into the backseat. As the doors slammed shut, he pressed his forehead against the cold window, his mind still spinning. He hadn't even seen a luxury watch, let alone stolen one. The city outside blurred as they drove to the station. For James, the line between reality and nightmare was quickly fading. James stood in the courtroom, his wrists now free, but his heart weighed down by chains far heavier than the cuffs he'd worn. The place was intimidating. Tall ceilings, polished wooden benches, and the sterile air of formality. He felt like an intruder in a world where the truth no longer mattered, only perceptions. Across the room sat Mr. Patterson, a wealthy businessman who had made no secret of his belief in James' guilt. His steely gaze never left James, as though he could will the verdict into existence by staring hard enough. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Next to him was Sarah, his public defender. She was young, overworked, and perhaps just as skeptical of his innocence as everyone else in the room. Sarah shuffled through a stack of documents, glancing briefly at James before addressing him for the first time since their rushed introduction. "Look, I'll be honest with you," Sarah said, lowering her voice. "The evidence isn't in your favor. They have witnesses who say you were near the scene. Patterson's watch is worth a fortune, and they're going to push hard for a conviction. But I'm going to do what I can." James nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He knew the odds were stacked against him, but hearing it aloud made it all the more real. The judge entered, and the trial began. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out their case. James had been seen near the park at the same time the theft occurred, and he fit the description of a man fleeing the scene. The evidence was circumstantial, but in a world that judged a man by his appearance, circumstantial evidence was often enough. James' heart pounded as the prosecutor spoke. Every word felt like another nail in the coffin, and despite his innocence, the world seemed intent on burying him. The first witness was called to the stand, an older woman who claimed to have seen James loitering near the park's entrance. Her voice trembled slightly as she described the moment she saw a man matching James' description leaving the area in a hurry. Her words were vague, but the effect on the jury was clear. Doubts settled in the air like fog, thick and unavoidable. Sarah leaned over to James and whispered, "This is just the beginning. Stay strong." But James wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. Every word spoken against him felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. He wanted to speak up, to shout his innocence, but he knew that wouldn't help his case. In this room, appearances were everything, and to them, he was just another homeless man who had crossed the line. As the day dragged on, James' mind began to wander. He thought back to a time when his life had been different, when he had a home, a job, and a family. that life felt like a distant memory now, swallowed by the cold reality of his current situation. James stared blankly ahead as the courtroom bustled with lawyers, the sounds of hushed voices and shuffling papers filling the space. His body was present, but his mind was far away, back to a time before everything fell apart. The hum of the air conditioning reminded him of the quiet hum that used to fill his office, back when he was an engineer with a promising career. It had all changed in an instant. The accident had taken everything from him: his wife, his daughter, his job. One moment of distraction on the road had led to a pileup that left his family shattered. The grief had consumed him, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't rebuild the pieces of his life. Losing his job had only been the beginning. Soon after, he lost his home. Without a place to go, he wandered the streets, each day blending into the next until he became invisible to the world around him. But the most painful part wasn't the homelessness. It was the realization that no one cared. He had always thought that people would help in times of crisis, but instead, the world seemed to forget him. He learned quickly that once you're on the streets, you become an afterthought, a ghost walking among the living. As James sat there, lost in memories, Sarah's voice jolted him back to the present. She was speaking with urgency, pulling him back to the harsh reality of his trial. "James," she said, leaning closer, "we're going to have to work together. I need to know more about where you were when the theft happened." James sighed, rubbing his temples. "I was in the park. I didn't see a watch, and I didn't steal anything. I was minding my own business." Sarah nodded, but her expression remained cautious. "The problem is, we don't have anyone to back up your story. The prosecution's witnesses are painting a picture of you as a criminal, and right now, we don't have enough to fight back." James closed his eyes, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep fighting this battle, but he had to try. If not for himself, then for the memory of the life he once had. The next day in court felt even more overwhelming. The prosecution was relentless, presenting every piece of evidence they could find to support their claim. The witnesses they called to the stand seemed determined to paint James as a suspicious figure, lurking in the park with ill intentions. The first witness, an elderly man who had been walking his dog that day, described how he had seen James sitting on the same park bench shortly before the theft. His description was vague, but the prosecution used his words to draw a direct link between James and the missing watch. "He was there, just sitting and watching people," the witness said. "It seemed strange to me." James clenched his fists under the table. Strange. He wasn't a criminal. He had been sitting there, minding his own business, trying to find a moment of peace in a chaotic world. But here he was, being portrayed as if he'd been plotting something sinister. Sarah stood and began her cross-examination. "You mentioned that James was sitting on the bench. Did you see him interact with anyone? Did you see him near the watch?" The witness shook his head. "No, I didn't see him take anything, but he was there." Sarah pressed on. "So you didn't actually see him commit any crime, correct?" The witness hesitated, but finally said, "No, I didn't." James felt a small sense of relief, but it was short-lived. The prosecution quickly pivoted to the next witness, a young woman who claimed to have seen someone matching James' description walking away from the scene. "Are you absolutely certain it was this man?" the prosecutor asked, pointing directly at James. The woman squirmed slightly in her seat. I think it was him. He looked like the person I saw. But it was a busy day." James' heart sank. It didn't matter that the witnesses weren't completely sure. The doubt was enough to sway the jury, and with every vague statement, he could feel the walls closing in around him. After hours of testimony, the judge called for a recess. James and Sarah returned to their corner of the courtroom, where Sarah began sifting through her notes, her brow furrowed. "We need something concrete, James," she muttered. "We need to find a way to prove you weren't involved." James nodded, feeling the heaviness of the moment. He wasn't sure what more he could do. The world already saw him as guilty, and in this courtroom, appearances seemed to be all that mattered. The courtroom echoed in James' mind as he and Sarah left for the day. The cold wind that greeted him outside was a bitter reminder of his reality. As he walked, Sarah's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. "I know it feels hopeless right now," she said, her breath visible in the air. "But I don't plan on giving up. We'll find something. I need more time to dig." James remained silent, his gaze fixed on the sidewalk ahead. It was hard to believe that anyone cared, even though Sarah seemed different from the others who had passed him by over the years. The next morning, Sarah dove head first into her investigation. She went back to the park where the theft allegedly took place, retracing James' steps. The bustling city around her seemed indifferent to her purpose, but she was determined. The clues had to be there, hidden in plain sight. She spoke to street vendors, park regulars, anyone who might have noticed something unusual that day. Most people had seen nothing, or worse, didn't care enough to offer help. But after several hours of searching, she stumbled upon something, a security camera perched atop a nearby coffee shop. It pointed toward the street, capturing part of the park in its view. Heart pounding, Sarah hurried inside, hoping against hope that the footage was still available. After some convincing, the manager allowed her access to the tapes. Sarah sat down, eyes glued to the screen as the footage from that day played out. People walked by, unaware that their every move was being recorded. It felt like searching for a needle in a haystack, but she couldn't afford to miss any details. Finally, she saw him, James, sitting on the park bench, alone and detached from the world around him. But then, something caught her eye. A woman nearby, appearing flustered and in distress. James had been looking in her direction, but instead of getting involved in the chaos surrounding the theft, he seemed to notice her struggling. The footage wasn't enough to exonerate him, but it was something. It showed that James wasn't running away, as others had described. He was present, yes, but not engaged in any crime. Sarah's mind raced. This woman could be a key witness, someone who saw what really happened. She had to find her. Meanwhile, James sat in his temporary holding cell, staring at the gray walls. Every moment in there felt like an eternity, a suffocating reminder of how far he had fallen. The isolation ate at him, but it wasn't the physical loneliness. It was the feeling of being abandoned by a world that once embraced him. His thoughts drifted to his family, to the moments of happiness before the accident. He had been a different man then, full of life, ambition, and love. He could still remember the sound of his daughter's laughter, the way she'd run into his arms at the end of each day. That life felt like it belonged to someone else now, a story that had been cruelly rewritten. But as the hours stretched on, something began to shift inside him. Sarah's determination had started to awaken something long dormant: hope. Maybe this time, someone would see him, not as a homeless man, but as a human being with a story, a past, and a future worth fighting for. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the courthouse with new energy. She had the footage in hand and had spent the night chasing down leads on the mystery woman. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but she knew they were still missing the final connection that could prove James' innocence. She sat down with him, her expression more determined than he had ever seen. "I found something," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "There's a woman, someone who was in the park at the same time as you. I think she might have seen what happened." James opened the folder and looked at the grainy images of the woman from the footage. Her face was partially obscured, but there was something familiar about her posture. He racked his brain, trying to place her, but came up empty. "Do you remember her?" Sarah asked, watching his face carefully. James shook his head. "No, but if she was there, maybe she saw something I didn't." Sarah nodded. "We need to find her. If she can confirm your story, it could be the break we need." James leaned back in his chair, a glimmer of hope flickering in his chest. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he might have a chance. It wasn't just about proving his innocence. It was about reclaiming his life. But with hope came fear. He had been down this road before, and every time, life had found a way to knock him back down. The stakes felt impossibly high. If this didn't work, if they couldn't find this woman or she didn't remember anything, James knew he'd be swallowed by the system for good. Still, Sarah's energy was contagious. She believed in him, something he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't sure how to handle it, but for now, he decided to trust her. Maybe this time, things would be different. The following day in court, the air was thick with tension. The prosecution, aware that Sarah had been conducting her own investigation, intensified their efforts. They were determined to paint James as guilty, even if the evidence was circumstantial. Mr. Patterson, the wealthy businessman whose watch had been stolen, sat confidently on the witness stand. His well-tailored suit and polished demeanor contrasted sharply with James' worn and weathered appearance. The prosecutor leaned in, his voice clear and forceful as he questioned Mr. Patterson about the value of the watch and how he felt upon discovering it had been stolen. "I was devastated," Mr. Patterson said, his voice calm but edged with indignation. That watch wasn't just valuable, it had sentimental worth. And to see someone like him, he gestured toward James, take it. It was infuriating. The prosecutor nodded sympathetically. "And you're absolutely certain that it was this man who stole it?" Mr. Patterson paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Well, I didn't see him take it with my own eyes, but I know it was him. He was loitering around, looking suspicious. It's always those types, people with nothing to lose." James' jaw tightened, anger simmering just beneath the surface. He could feel the jury's eyes on him, weighing every word Mr. Patterson said. To them, James was already guilty, just as Mr. Patterson described. A man with nothing to lose, a man who had fallen too far. Sarah stood up for her cross-examination. "Mr. Patterson," she began, her voice steady, "you've testified that you didn't actually see my client take the watch. So, you're basing your accusation purely on his appearance and the fact that he was nearby." Mr. Patterson shifted slightly. "He was there, wasn't he? What was a man like that doing in the park anyway?" Sarah pressed on. "Do you often make assumptions about people based on their appearance or their circumstances?" "I'm not assuming anything," Mr. Patterson snapped. "It's just common sense." Sarah paused, letting his words hang in the air before continuing. "Mr. Patterson, would it surprise you to know that we found security footage that shows my client in the park at the time of the theft? Footage that doesn't support your claims?" Mr. Patterson's face hardened. "I don't care what some camera shows. I know what I saw." The tension in the courtroom was palpable. James watched as the prosecution scrambled to regain control. Sarah had managed to plant a seed of doubt, but he knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. After the trial recessed for the day, Sarah raced against time to track down the woman in the security footage. She had spent hours poring over databases, trying to match the face in the grainy video with a name, but it had been slow work. The pressure was mounting. If they didn't find her soon, they would have little left to fight with. Just as Sarah was beginning to lose hope, she received a breakthrough. A match. A woman named Emily had been in the park that day and was listed as a potential witness in the original police report, though she had never been contacted for a follow-up. Sarah immediately called her heart pounding as she waited for an answer. After a few rings, a soft voice answered, "Hello? Hi, this is Sarah," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm a public defender, and I'm representing James Carter. I believe you were in the park on the day of the theft he's being accused of, and I'd really like to talk to you." There was a pause on the other end. "I remember that day. I saw the commotion, but I didn't think it had anything to do with me. I didn't steal anything." Sarah's pulse quickened. "I'm not accusing you of anything, Emily. I believe you might have seen something that could help my client. There's footage showing that James was nearby, but from what I can tell, he wasn't involved in the theft. I need your help to prove that." Another silence followed, but then Emily responded quietly. "I saw someone else that day. A man in a hoodie, not the one you're representing. He was acting strange, watching people too closely. I remember him because he made me uncomfortable." Sarah's heart leaped. This was it, the break they needed. "Emily, this could be really important. Would you be willing to testify in court about what you saw?" "I don't know," Emily said hesitantly. "I don't like getting involved in these things. I understand, but James' future is on the line. Your testimony could make all the difference in clearing his name," Sarah urged. Emily sighed. "Okay, I'll do it." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. This was the first real sign of hope they'd had since the trial began. She hung up the phone, her mind racing. Now, all they had to do was prepare Emily to testify in court, and with her account, they might finally tip the scales in James' favor. That night, Sarah visited James to give him the news. "We found her," she said, sitting across from him. "The woman in the footage. Her name's Emily, and she's agreed to testify. She saw someone else in the park that day, a man who was acting suspiciously, not you?" James looked at her, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "So there's a chance." Sarah smiled for the first time in days. "There's more than a chance. We're going to fight this." James leaned back in his chair, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was the first time since his arrest that the walls didn't feel like they were closing in. The courtroom was unusually quiet as Sarah prepared to call Emily to the stand. James sat nervously beside her, his hands clenched tightly together. Today could be the turning point, but the weight of the moment was pressing down on him. He hadn't allowed himself to hope for too long. Hope had been too dangerous for a man in his situation. Sarah stood, her voice steady as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, the defense calls Emily Davis to the stand." There was a soft murmur as Emily walked to the front of the courtroom. She looked nervous, her eyes darting toward James for just a moment before quickly looking away. Sarah gave her a reassuring nod as she took her place in the witness box. After the formalities were completed, Sarah began her questioning. "Emily, can you tell the court where you were on the day in question?" Emily shifted slightly in her seat. "I was in the park, sitting near the fountain. I go there sometimes to relax. I saw a lot of people that day. And do you remember seeing James Carter, the man seated over there?" Sarah gestured to James. Emily glanced at him again before nodding. "Yes, I saw him. He was sitting on a bench, just watching people. Did you see him do anything suspicious or criminal?" Sarah asked, her voice calm but firm. "No," Emily replied confidently. "He was just sitting there. He didn't look like he was involved in any trouble." The prosecutor stood up, ready to object, but Sarah pressed on. "Emily, you mentioned to me during our conversation that you saw someone else in the park that day. Could you describe that person?" Emily swallowed nervously before continuing. "There was a man wearing a dark hoodie. He kept walking back and forth, looking around like he was waiting for something or someone. It made me uncomfortable, so I watched him for a while." "And what happened next?" Sarah asked, her tone encouraging. "I saw him move toward the area where the theft happened. He disappeared for a bit, and then there was all this noise, people shouting. I looked over, and that's when I noticed the man was gone. He left right after the commotion started." The courtroom was silent as Emily's words hung in the air. Sarah let the moment breathe before speaking again. "So, to be clear, you saw someone else acting suspiciously and leaving the scene of the theft, but you did not see James Carter commit any crime?" Emily nodded. "That's right." The prosecutor quickly jumped to his feet, attempting to discredit Emily's testimony. "Ms. Davis, isn't it possible that you're mistaken? You didn't get a good look at this man, and the park was crowded. How can you be sure that what you saw is accurate?" Emily looked flustered, but held her ground. "I know what I saw. The man in the hoodie was acting strange, and I remember that clearly." Sarah's heart raced as she watched the jury's expressions. Emily's testimony had sown the seeds of doubt. The perfect narrative that the prosecution had built around James was starting to crack. Despite the breakthrough in court, James knew the battle wasn't over. The media had latched onto his case from the beginning, spinning sensationalized stories that painted him as a heartless thief. Reporters stood outside the courthouse every day, their lenses pointed at James as if they were waiting for him to crack under the pressure. Sarah warned him not to pay attention to the headlines, but it was impossible to ignore them entirely. Homeless man steals luxury watch. Vagrant thief stuns courtroom with defense. The words blared from the papers and news sites, making James feel like he was on trial, not just in the courtroom, but in the public eye. As the trial progressed, the media continued to shape public perception. Commentators speculated about James' past, his character, and whether someone in his position could ever be trustworthy. Each time James walked into the courtroom, he felt the weight of those headlines pressing down on him, as though they had already decided his fate. Sarah knew the importance of changing the narrative, but fighting the media's portrayal of James felt like an uphill battle. She arranged for James to sit down with a sympathetic journalist, someone who had shown interest in telling the human side of his story. The interview was scheduled to take place during a recess in the trial, and it was one of the few chances they had to counter the damaging headlines. The journalist, Rachel, was a kind woman in her mid-30s, known for her thoughtful and nuanced reporting. She sat across from James in a quiet room, her recorder between them. "James," she began softly, "I want to give you a chance to tell your side of the story. The media has painted you in a certain light, but I'm more interested in hearing who you are as a person." James hesitated, unsure if he could trust anyone in the media. But Rachel's sincerity was clear, and he decided to take the risk. "I wasn't always homeless," he said quietly. "I had a life, a good life. I had a family, a job, a home. But that all disappeared after the accident. I didn't choose to end up on the streets." Rachel listened carefully, her expression compassionate. "And how does it feel to be here now, in court, fighting for your innocence?" James looked down at his hands, the calluses and scars that told the story of his survival on the streets. "It's terrifying," he admitted. "People look at me and see a thief, a criminal. They don't see the person I was before, or the person I still am." Rachel nodded. "What do you want people to know about you?" James paused, the weight of his words heavy. "I want them to know that just because someone is homeless, it doesn't mean they're invisible. It doesn't mean they don't matter. I've made mistakes in my life, but I didn't steal that watch. I just want a chance to prove that." The interview was published the next day, and though it didn't change every mind, it softened some of the harsh opinions about James. The media, for once, portrayed him as more than just a homeless man accused of theft. They began to see him as a human being with a past, a present, and hopefully a future. Back in the courtroom, the trial continued. The prosecution's case was unraveling, and with Emily's testimony, the balance of the trial had shifted. But James knew that the final decision rested with the jury, and their perceptions had been shaped by far more than just the evidence presented in court. Officer Mitchell sat in his patrol car, staring blankly through the windshield as the sounds of the city buzzed around him. His thoughts were miles away, replaying the arrest over and over again in his mind. At the time, everything had seemed so clear. James was just another homeless man, and when the accusations of theft came, Mitchell hadn't questioned it. Why would he? The case had seemed open and shut. But now, with the trial unfolding and new evidence coming to light, Mitchell was beginning to doubt everything. The truth was he hadn't looked too closely at the details. He had followed the process, arrested the man based on witness reports and circumstantial evidence. But something about the way Sarah had presented the new witness testimony had stirred something inside him. Could he have been wrong? Was it possible that James was innocent and had simply been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? Mitchell shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away, but they stuck like glue. He'd always prided himself on doing his job well, but if James was innocent, then Mitchell had played a part in destroying a man's life. The weight of that realization was more than he could bear. Unable to shake the feeling, Mitchell made a decision. He needed to dig deeper. He returned to the station and pulled up the original report from the day of the arrest. As he went over the details, his unease grew. The evidence had been thin from the start, and now, with Emily's testimony, it was clear that the case was built on shaky ground. Mitchell decided to visit the park again, retracing the steps he had taken on the day of the arrest. As he walked through the park, his eyes scanned the familiar surroundings, the benches, the fountain, the spot where Mr. Patterson had claimed his watch was stolen. It all looked the same, but now, with the knowledge that something might have been missed, everything felt different. He spoke to a few of the regulars who frequented the park, asking if anyone had noticed anything unusual that day. Most of them had seen nothing, but one older man mentioned something that made Mitchell pause. "I remember a guy in a hoodie," the man said, scratching his chin. "He was walking back and forth, looked kinda shifty, but I didn't think much of it at the time." Mitchell's heart sank. The man's description matched Emily's account, and now, for the first time, Mitchell realized he might have overlooked a critical piece of the puzzle. He had focused so much on James, the easy target, that he had missed what was right in front of him. Back at the station, Mitchell struggled with what to do next. If he came forward with his doubts, it would be admitting that he hadn't done his job properly. But if he stayed silent, an innocent man might be convicted. The decision weighed heavily on him. But in the end, he knew what he had to do. The next day, Officer Mitchell arrived at the courthouse, his uniform pressed and his face grim. He found Sarah in the hallway and pulled her aside. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low but urgent. Sarah looked at him with suspicion. "What is it, Officer Mitchell?" "I think I might have been wrong," he admitted, his voice filled with regret. "When I arrested James, I didn't look close enough at the other possibilities. There was a man in a hoodie, someone who fits the description of what your witness saw. I think I missed it, and I'm willing to testify to that in court." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "You're serious?" Mitchell nodded, his expression somber. "I don't want to see an innocent man go down because I didn't do my job right. If I can help, I will." Sarah's face softened. "Thank you, officer. This could make a huge difference." As Mitchell walked away, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was finally doing the right thing. The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation. Sarah had spent the last few days preparing for Officer Mitchell's testimony, knowing that his admission could be the turning point in the trial. She had rehearsed every question, every angle, determined to ensure that his testimony would dismantle the prosecution's case. James sat beside her, his eyes scanning the room nervously. He knew the trial was nearing its end, and with that came a sense of both dread and hope. So much had been said, so much had been revealed, but the final decision still rested in the hands of the jury. And that was the part that scared him most. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked, turning to James. He nodded, though the knot in his stomach told him otherwise. "As ready as I'll ever be." The judge called the courtroom to order, and the proceedings resumed. Sarah wasted no time in calling Officer Mitchell to the stand. As Mitchell walked to the front of the courtroom, the tension in the room seemed to rise. Once sworn in, Sarah began her questioning. "Officer Mitchell, can you tell the court about your involvement in the arrest of James Carter?" Mitchell cleared his throat. "I was the arresting officer. We received a call about a stolen watch, and when we arrived at the park, multiple witnesses pointed us toward Mr. Carter. Based on their descriptions and the circumstances, we arrested him. And at the time, did you believe you had enough evidence to make that arrest?" Sarah asked, her voice measured. Mitchell hesitated for a moment before answering. "At the time, yes. But looking back, I realized that I might have acted too quickly. I didn't consider other possibilities." Sarah leaned forward. "What do you mean by that?" Mitchell took a deep breath. There was another man in the park that day, someone who matched the description of the real thief. He was wearing a dark hoodie and acting suspiciously, but I didn't pay him much attention. I was focused on Mr. Carter because he fit the description the witnesses had given us. And now, having had time to reflect, do you believe that Mr. Carter may not have been the person responsible for the theft?" Sarah asked, her tone calm but direct. "I do," Mitchell said firmly. "I believe I made a mistake in arresting him." The prosecutor quickly jumped up to cross-examine. "Officer Mitchell, are you telling us that you're basing this change of heart on one vague recollection of a man in a hoodie? Isn't it possible that your memory is faulty after all this time?" Mitchell held his ground. "I'm not saying my memory is perfect, but I know what I saw, and I believe that Mr. Carter wasn't involved." The prosecutor pressed further, but Mitchell didn't waver. His testimony had introduced a critical element of doubt, and Sarah knew that the jury was listening closely. The prosecutor's case was unraveling, and with every word Mitchell spoke, the scales tipped further in James' favor. As the day came to a close, Sarah felt a cautious sense of optimism. They were getting closer to the end, and for the first time, it felt like they might actually win. James, on the other hand, was filled with a strange mixture of hope and fear. So much had been said, and yet the outcome remained uncertain. The jury was still out there, weighing every word, every detail. And until the final verdict was delivered, James knew that his fate remained hanging in the balance. The courtroom was tense as the trial reached its final stages. Sarah stood tall and prepared for the final push, her heart pounding but her mind clear. She knew this was her last chance to sway the jury. The testimonies, the evidence, and the doubts she had carefully introduced all led to this moment. James, sitting beside her, looked as though he had aged years since the start of the trial. His face was lined with exhaustion, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes, fueled by the belief that, finally, the truth might come to light. The prosecutor, aware that his case was hanging by a thread, had called Mr. Patterson back to the stand for one last attempt to solidify the narrative that James was guilty. He stood at the front of the courtroom, calm and composed, while Mr. Patterson took his seat. Mr. Patterson, could you please remind the jury of the events as you saw them on the day your watch was stolen? The prosecutor asked, trying to reassert the original story. Mr. Patterson glanced at James before turning his attention back to the prosecutor. I was walking through the park when I realized my watch was missing. I looked around, saw Mr. Carter, and immediately knew he was involved. He looked like he didn't belong there. The prosecutor nodded. And you are confident that Mr. Carter was the one responsible for the theft? Mr. Patterson hesitated slightly, aware of how the case had developed, but his pride and bias won out. Yes, I am. The prosecutor thanked him and handed the floor to Sarah for cross-examination. Sarah approached the stand with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent days picking apart the prosecution's case. Mr. Patterson, she began, you testified earlier that you didn't actually see Mr. Carter take your watch. Is that correct? Yes, but, Patterson began. Sarah interrupted, her voice calm but firm. So your accusation is based solely on your perception of Mr. Carter's appearance and his presence in the park that day. Mr. Patterson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I suppose you could say that. Thank you, Sarah said, pausing to let the moment settle before continuing. And are you aware that Officer Mitchell has testified that there was another man in the park that day, someone acting suspiciously, whom you didn't notice? Mr. Patterson's eyes flickered with uncertainty. I wasn't paying attention to anyone else. I saw Mr. Carter, and I assumed. But assumptions aren't facts, are they, Mr. Patterson? Sarah said, her voice now sharper. You assumed Mr. Carter was guilty because he didn't fit your image of who should be in the park. But there is no direct evidence linking him to the theft, is there? Mr. Patterson remained silent, his confidence eroded by Sarah's words. No further questions, Sarah said, stepping back. The prosecutor tried to regain control with a few closing remarks, but the damage had been done. Sarah had succeeded in casting doubt on Mr. Patterson's testimony, and more importantly, she had highlighted the danger of basing accusations on assumptions rather than facts. As the trial drew to a close, the judge addressed the jury, instructing them to deliberate carefully. The jury members filed out of the courtroom, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. All that was left now was to wait. The hours dragged on as James and Sarah sat in the nearly empty courtroom, waiting for the jury to return. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passage of time with an almost unbearable rhythm. James shifted in his seat, trying to calm the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. Would the jury see the truth, or would they be swayed by the prejudices that had followed him since the day of his arrest? James had lived his life on the edge for so long, accustomed to being judged by his appearance and circumstances. He had dared to hope for a different outcome, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. Sarah remained silent beside him, reviewing her notes one last time. There was nothing more she could do now except wait. She had fought as hard as she could, presenting the evidence, cross-examining witnesses, and challenging the prosecution at every turn. Now it was up to the 12 strangers who sat in the jury room, deciding James' fate. After what felt like an eternity, the door to the jury room finally opened. The jurors filed back into the courtroom, their expressions unreadable. James felt his heart leap into his throat as the judge took his seat and asked the jury for their decision. The foreman of the jury stood, holding a small piece of paper in his hands. The courtroom fell silent as he cleared his throat. Your Honor, we, the jury, find the defendant, James Carter, not guilty. For a moment, James didn't move. He didn't dare breathe, afraid that he had misheard, that it was all some cruel joke. But as the words sunk in, a wave of relief washed over him. Not guilty. He was free. beside him. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned to James, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "We did it." James' legs felt weak as he stood up, his emotions a chaotic mix of disbelief, relief, and gratitude. He had fought so hard to prove his innocence, but now that the moment had arrived, it didn't feel real. The judge thanked the jury for their service, and slowly, the courtroom began to clear out. As James walked toward the exit, the reporters outside clamored for his attention, eager to capture his first words after the verdict. But James wasn't ready to face the cameras just yet. He needed a moment to breathe, to process what had just happened. He and Sarah stepped outside into the cool air, the sounds of the city buzzing around them. James inhaled deeply, savoring the freedom he had feared would be taken from him. The world felt different now, lighter, more open. Sarah turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "What are you going to do now, James?" James looked out at the city streets, the endless possibilities stretching before him. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel lost. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I think it's time I started living again." As James stepped outside the courthouse, a strange sense of weightlessness enveloped him. He had spent weeks anticipating this moment, but now that it had come, it felt surreal. The world outside seemed different, brighter, as if someone had turned the lights up just a bit more. He was free, and yet, the journey he had endured to reach this point had left deep scars, scars that wouldn't heal overnight. The press surged forward, their cameras flashing, their voices overlapping in a barrage of questions. James blinked, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. He had been invisible for so long, and now, all eyes were on him. He turned instinctively to Sarah, who was already fielding questions from reporters, her calm professionalism unwavering. "How does it feel to be acquitted, Mr. Carter?" one journalist shouted, holding a microphone inches from his face. James hesitated, unsure of what to say. What could he say? Relief? Gratitude? Exhaustion? The words didn't seem to fit the complexity of what he felt. He glanced at Sarah, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I'm just glad the truth came out," he said, his voice quieter than he had intended. "I didn't steal anything, and I'm thankful the jury saw that." As the reporters pressed in closer, James felt a wave of discomfort. He had fought so hard to be seen as a human being, but now, with the flashing lights and rapid-fire questions, he felt more like a spectacle than ever before. Sarah gently placed a hand on his arm. "Let's go," she said softly, steering him away from the crowd and toward a quieter side street. They walked in silence for a few moments, the noise of the reporters fading into the background. "You did it," she said after a while, her voice warm. "You proved your innocence." James smiled faintly. "I couldn't have done it without you." Sarah shook her head. "You gave me something to fight for, James." "I just did my job." They walked in comfortable silence, the weight of the trial slowly beginning to lift. For James, there was a quiet sense of victory, but also a deep, lingering sadness for everything that had been lost along the way. His time on the streets, the way people had looked at him, the accusations, those things wouldn't disappear overnight. As they neared the subway station, James paused, turning to Sarah. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Sarah studied him for a moment. "That's up to you. You've got a second chance, James. What do you want to do with it?" James considered her words. For so long, his life had been defined by survival, by scraping by day to day. Now, the future stretched out before him, full of possibilities he hadn't dared to imagine. But the fear of slipping back into obscurity, of being forgotten again, still loomed large in his mind. "I'm not sure yet," he admitted, "but I think I want to help others. People like me who've been judged unfairly." Sarah smiled. "That sounds like a good place to start." With that, James took a deep breath. Stepping onto the subway platform, the first steps of his new life already beginning to form in his mind. In the days following his acquittal, James found himself adjusting to a world that felt both familiar and alien at the same time. He had lived on the margins for so long that re-entering society felt like learning to walk all over again. The weight of his experiences lingered, but there was also a sense of hope, a sense that he could build something new from the ashes of his old life. One morning, James received a phone call from Rachel, the journalist who had interviewed him during the trial. She had followed up on his story and wanted to write a feature about his life after the verdict. "I think people need to hear what happens next," Rachel said over the phone. "You've been through so much, and your story doesn't end with the trial." James hesitated. The attention still made him uncomfortable, but he knew Rachel had treated his story with respect before. Perhaps sharing his journey might help others in similar situations. "Okay," he agreed. "Let's do it." The interview took place in a small coffee shop, far away from the hustle of the courthouse and the glare of cameras. Rachel asked about his plans, and James spoke honestly about his hopes to help others who had been unjustly accused, about his desire to advocate for people who had been silenced by society. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I did," James said, his voice steady. "People are quick to judge, and once they make up their minds, it's hard to change their perceptions. But everyone deserves a chance to be heard." Rachel nodded, scribbling notes. "And how are you doing personally? How are you adjusting?" James paused, thinking carefully before answering. "It's not easy," he admitted. "I've been on the streets for so long that it's hard to just snap back into a normal life. There's a lot I still need to figure out, but I'm getting there one step at a time." Rachel smiled, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. His love for books, the small joys he had rediscovered since the trial. As the interview wrapped up, James felt a sense of closure. His story wasn't over, but this chapter had finally come to an end. As weeks turned into months, James began to find his footing. He started volunteering at a local shelter, helping others who were struggling to rebuild their lives. He spoke to groups about his experience, sharing his story in the hope that it would inspire others not to give up, no matter how hopeless their situation seemed. The shelter became a second home to him, a place where he could make a real difference. And while the pain of his past hadn't fully healed, James found comfort in the knowledge that he was no longer defined by it. He had been judged, wrongly accused, and nearly broken by the system, but he had emerged on the other side stronger, more determined to live a life of purpose. One evening, after a long day at the shelter, James sat on a park bench, the same park where his ordeal had begun. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. As he looked around at the people passing by, he realized that, for the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He pulled out a notebook and began to write, letting the words flow freely. It was a letter to himself, a reminder of how far he had come and a promise to never let the world's judgment define him again. "I am more than what they see," he wrote. "I am more than the labels, more than the mistakes, more than the hardships. I am someone with a story, and that story is still being written." And with that, James closed the notebook, stood up, and walked into the future with his head held high. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave a like to support the channel. I'd love to hear from you. What part of the story had the biggest impact on you? Was it James' struggle for justice, the courtroom drama, or his journey to redemption? Let me know in the comments below. And I want to hear your ideas. Have a story you'd like to see featured on the channel? Drop your suggestions in the comments, and who knows, your idea might be the next story we bring to life. Your feedback means a world to me, and it helps shape the future of the channel. Thanks for being a part of this journey.